Welcome back to Nightfall History. Tonight we're talking about a man whose name became a word. Not just in Latin, not just in Italian or English and German. They called their emperors Kaiser in Russian. They called them Tsar. Both words come from one named Caesar. That's how deep this one man cut into the memory of civilization. So settle in, because this is the story of Julius Caesar, how he rose, how he was betrayed, and how his death accidentally destroyed the very thing his killers were trying to save. Let's start where most interesting stories start, with a young man who is by all appearances completely unimpressive. Julius Caesar was born into a patrician family, old Roman aristocracy, good name, respectable lineage. The kind of family that could trace its roots back to the goddess Venus. If you believe the family's own account of itself, which to be fair, most people did not. The family was noble, but not particularly powerful, wealthy, but not extravagantly so. They had the right connections and the right pedigree, but they were not the ruling inner circle of Rome. Caesar was, in other words, a member of the establishment who didn't quite run the establishment, yet died as a teenager. He came dangerously close to not surviving long enough to become famous at all. Rome at the time was in the grip of a savage political civil war between the factions, the optimates, who represented the old conservative aristocracy, and the populares, who appealed to the common people and the lower classes. Caesar's uncle by marriage was Marius, one of the great heroes of the populares. When the optimates under a general named Sulla seized power with actual legions and started making lists of people whose property would be confiscated and whose lives were suddenly very much at risk, the teenage Caesar found himself on the wrong side of history. Sulla stripped him of his inheritance and his wife's dowry and demanded he divorce her. Caesar refused, which, given that Sulla was at the time the most terrifying man in Rome, was either enormously brave or enormously reckless, probably both. Friends eventually convinced Sulla to spare him. Sulla apparently agreed, but with a warning that has echoed through history ever since. In this Caesar, he said, there are many Mariuses, meaning this boy is dangerous. Watch him. Sulla's instincts were correct. They were just about 30 years too early. Caesar spent his early adult years doing what ambitious young Romans did, serving in the military, studying rhetoric in Greece, building political connections, and running up enormous debts. The debts are actually important. Ancient Rome operated on a system of patronage and public generosity. To build a political career, you needed to be seen as lavish, generous, publicly spirited. You funded games, you threw feasts, you built things. All of this cost money that Caesar did not have, so he borrowed it from people who did, most notably from a fabulously wealthy man named Marcus Licinius Crassus, who was apparently very comfortable, lending money to promising young politicians and watching his investment appreciate over time. Caesar was charming, politically savvy, and possessed of a gift for oratory that contemporaries compared to the greatest speakers of the age. He was also, and this is not always mentioned, apparently excellent with people on an individual level. Ancient sources note that he remembered the names of soldiers he had met years before, that he had a quality of making whoever he was speaking to feel like the most important person in the room. In an age before polling or focus groups, this was the equivalent of a superpower. He climbed the ladder of Roman public offices steadily: quaestor, aedile, praetor. Each step involved an election. Each election involved spending money he didn't have and making promises he intended to keep only selectively. By the time he was in his late 30s, he was well known, well liked by the urban population, and deeply in debt. What he needed was a military command, something that would give him soldiers' glory, and most importantly, the kind of wealth that came from conquering other people's territory. But before the military campaigns, there was a political moment that changed everything. Around the time Caesar was elected consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic, essentially co-president, for a year, he entered into an arrangement with two other powerful men that historians have called the first triumvirate. The three men were Caesar himself, Pompey, Rome's greatest living general, a man of enormous military prestige and considerable political frustration, and Crassus the financier, who had more money than almost anyone and the political influence that came with it, but who lacked the military reputation he craved. Together, these three men, through informal agreement, mutual backscratching, and the occasional strategic marriage alliance, effectively ran Rome for several years without any of them holding absolute power. It was a coalition of convenience between three very different men, held together by mutual benefit and the shared understanding that the moment one of them became unnecessary, things would get complicated. Caesar used his consulship aggressively, pushing through land reform legislation that his opponents hated maneuvering around the Senate's obstruction with a kind of cheerful ruthlessness that shocked traditionalists. When his year as consul ended, he arranged for himself an extraordinary command, the governorship of Gaul, which at the time meant roughly the northern parts of modern Italy, and a small Roman province in what is now southern France. Beyond that was the rest of Gaul, a vast territory stretching to the Rhine, and the English Channel populated by Celtic tribes, who were very much not part of the Roman world yet. Caesar was going to fix that. The Gallic Wars, which consumed most of the next decade of Caesar's life, were one of the most consequential military campaigns in ancient history and one of the most violent. Gaul was not a single unified nation waiting to be conquered. It was a patchwork of tribes, some allied with Rome, some at war with each other, some technically neutral and deeply unhappy about the Roman presence expanding into their territory. Caesar moved through this landscape with remarkable military speed, at flexibility, forming alliances where convenient, breaking them when necessary, and fighting when talking failed, which was Caesar, was not always as often as you might hope. If you were a Gallic chieftain, he also wrote about it, which is unusual for a general and extremely useful for historians. The Gallic Wars is one of the most famous works of Latin prose ever written, and Caesar wrote it himself about himself in the third person, which tells you something about his ego, but also about his extraordinary intelligence. He refers to himself throughout as simply Caesar, as though he were a natural force rather than a man, as though the weather and Caesar were roughly equivalent phenomena that simply happened to Gaul. Whether Gaul liked it or not, the campaigns were brutal by any standard. Whole populations were enslaved. Tribes that resisted were destroyed. Caesar crossed the Rhine into Germany twice more as a show of Roman power than out of any serious intention to conquer it. He crossed the Channel into Britain also twice, which the Romans found bewildering and exotic, and which produced less military result than the propaganda value it was clearly designed to generate. But the campaigns in Gaul proper were genuinely decisive. By the time it was over, Rome's borders had been pushed to the Rhine and the Atlantic, and Caesar had the battle-hardened, fanatically loyal army and the enormous wealth that he had gone to Gaul to find. The most dramatic moment of the Gallic Wars came near the end at a place called Aulesia, where a Gallic chieftain named Vercingetorix, a man whose name alone suggests he was not someone to be trifled with, united many of the Gallic tribes in a last great revolt against Roman rule. Vercingetorix was a brilliant military commander who understood that fighting Caesar in open battle was suicide, so he adopted a strategy of retreat and scorched earth, trying to draw the Roman legions into a war of attrition they couldn't win. He almost succeeded. Caesar, facing the possibility of military disaster, responded with one of the most audacious engineering projects in ancient warfare. He besieged the Gallic stronghold at Aulesia, building an enormous ring of fortifications around it to keep Vercingetorix in, and then, when a massive Gallic relief army arrived to break the siege, built a second ring of fortifications facing outward to keep the relief army out. He was simultaneously besieging one army and being besieged by another, using fortifications as both weapon and shield. It is the kind of thing that makes military historians slightly giddy even 2,000 years later. Vercingetorix eventually surrendered. He was taken to Rome, displayed in Caesar's triumph, and later executed. Gaul was Roman. Meanwhile, back in Rome, things had been falling apart in the way that things in Rome tended to fall apart spectacularly, violently, and with a great deal of oratory. The triumvirate was dead. Crassus had gone east looking for the military glory he had always craved, leading a Roman army against the Parthian Empire and dying catastrophically at the Battle of Carrhae in one of Rome's most humiliating military defeats. Pompey, who had been Caesar's political ally and whose daughter had been Caesar's wife until she died in childbirth, was drifting toward the Senate conservatives, who had always been Caesar's enemies. The Senate, frightened of Caesar's power and his loyal army, began maneuvering to strip him of his command and bring him back to Rome as a private citizen, where he could be prosecuted for various questionable things he had done during his consulship. Caesar understood the situation clearly. If he gave up his army and returned to Rome as a private citizen, he would be politically destroyed and possibly exiled or executed. His only protection was the legions. His enemies knew this too, which is why they were so determined to make him give them up. In early January, the Senate passed a measure demanding Caesar disband his army. Caesar sent a counter-proposal: he'd disband if Pompey did too. The Senate refused. The crisis had arrived. On the night of January 10th, or thereabouts, historians argue about the exact date, Julius Caesar stood on the northern bank of a small river in northern Italy called the Rubicon. Crossing it with his army would be an act of treason under Roman law. Roman generals were forbidden from bringing armed troops into Italy proper. Everyone knew what crossing the Rubicon meant. Caesar knew, his officers knew, the soldiers knew. He crossed anyway. Ancient sources give him a famous line, "At this moment the dies Castalia iacta estate the weather." He actually said it, and in exactly which language and in what dramatic tone is the kind of thing we cannot know. What we know is that he crossed the river with one legion and Rome was never the same. What followed was a civil war, though it was a civil war unlike most. Caesar moved south through Italy with such speed that Pompey and the Senate, who had expected to be able to organize resistance, found themselves completely outpaced. Town after town opened its gates. Soldiers who were supposed to be defending against Caesar simply joined him instead, because he had a reputation for mercy, because many of them were from the lower sea, lasses that had always supported the populares, and because there is something about a man moving very fast toward you with a battle-hardened army that encourages a certain pragmatic flexibility in one's political allegiances. Pompey fled to Greece. Caesar followed. They met at the Battle of Pharsalus in Thessaly, and it was decisive. Pompey's army was larger, his cavalry was better, and by the conventional logic of ancient warfare, he should have won. Caesar outmaneuvered him. Specifically, he anticipated Pompey's cavalry charge and trained a fourth line of infantry with specific instructions on how to counter it. When Pompey's cavalry swept around Caesar's flank in what was supposed to be the killing blow, Caesar's specially trained infantry turned to face them and drove them back. Pompey's army collapsed. Pompey escaped to Egypt, where, as we discussed in another episode, things went very badly for him very quickly. Caesar arrived in Alexandria to find his great rival already dead, wrapped in a dirty cloth on the beach, and reportedly wept. Whether these were genuine tears for a man he had once admired and been politically allied with, or the calculated grief of a man who understood the political value of appearing magnanimous, we cannot say. Probably some mixture of both. Caesar spent time in Egypt, more time than military necessity required, as we have established, and then returned to finish the war against the remaining Pompeian forces. He fought in Africa. He fought in Spain. He won and won and won, and each victory made him more powerful and his enemies more desperate. By the time all the wars were over, Caesar was the undisputed master of the Roman world. And here is where his story gets philosophically interesting, because what Caesar did with that power reveals both his extraordinary vision and the fundamental contradiction at the heart of his position. He did not want to destroy Rome. He loved Rome. He was a product of Rome, a Roman to his core, a man who had memorized the Latin poets and could quote Greek philosophy and who understood the Republic's traditions intimately. He did not want to burn the city down. He wanted to fix it, and to fix it, he concluded, required a kind of concentrated personal authority that the Republic's institutions were not designed to accommodate. He was appointed dictator, a temporary office with broad powers that the Roman Constitution actually provided for in emergencies, though typically for 6 months at a time. Caesar was appointed dictator for 10 years and then shortly before his death for life. Dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. He was in every meaningful sense a monarch. He just was called one because the Romans had expelled their last king 5 centuries before, and the word king was essentially a political slur. What did he do with this power? Quite a lot, actually, and much of it was genuinely good. He reformed the calendar. The old Roman calendar had drifted so far out of alignment with the actual solar year that the months no longer matched the seasons they were supposed to represent, which was confusing for farmers, priests, and everyone else. Caesar, working with an Egyptian astronomer named Sosigenes, introduced the Julian calendar, which added a leap year every 4 years and aligned the calendar so closely with reality that it remained in use across most of the Western world for over 15 centuries. We still use a slightly adjusted version of it today. Not bad for a side project. He reformed Roman law to extend citizenship more broadly throughout the empire. He launched major building projects. He resettled veterans on land in the provinces. He was generous to his former enemies in ways that shocked observers. People expected a victor in a Roman civil war to execute his opponent. Caesar instead forgave them, returned their property, appointed many of them to positions of power. This was called clemency claimantia, and Caesar made it practically a personal brand. He was not just powerful, he was magnanimously powerful, which was both a genuine character trait and very good politics. But the more powerful Caesar became, the more uncomfortable many Romans grew. Not everyone who opposed him was simply a selfish aristocrat defending his own privileges, though many were. Some were genuinely committed to the ideal of republican government, the idea that no single man should hold unchecked power, that Rome's greatness had come precisely from its system of shared authority, its checks. It balances its tradition of men holding power temporarily and then stepping down. To these men, Caesar was not a reformer. He was a threat to everything Rome was supposed to stand for. There were also those who resented him personally. Brutus, who would become the most famous of the conspirators, had been forgiven by Caesar. After fighting on Pompey's side, Caesar had specifically ordered that Brutus not be harmed in battle. Possibly out of genuine fondness for him, Brutus had been appointed to high positions under Caesar's rule, and yet Brutus despised what Caesar represented. His ancestor, so the family legend went, had been the man who expelled Rome's last king centuries before. For Brutus, opposing tyranny was practically a hereditary obligation. Cassius, who organized the conspiracy and recruited Brutus into it, was a different kind of man, more calculating, more personally bitter, less idealistic. Ancient sources suggest he resented Caesar on a level that went beyond political principle. Though Cassius was also genuinely committed to the Republic, he was the kind of man who was very good at seeing what needed to be done and not particularly troubled by the complications involved in doing it. A dangerous quality in a conspirator. The conspiracy grew. By the time it was ready to act, somewhere around 24 men were involved, senators, men of prominence, men who had been Caesar's allies and Caesar's enemies and everything in between. They called themselves the liberatores, the liberators. They were going to free Rome from a tyrant. There were warnings. Ancient sources written after the fact, and therefore perhaps inclined toward dramatic hindsight, are full of them. A soothsayer warning Caesar to beware the Ides of March, his wife Calpurnia having terrible dreams and begging him not to go to the Senate meeting, strange omens, animals behaving oddly, unusual atmospheric phenomena, the kinds of things that Romans took very seriously as signs from the gods, and that modern readers tend to treat as narrative decoration. Whether any of these warnings were real, whether Caesar heard them and dismissed them, or dismissed them without hearing them, we cannot know. What we know is that he went. The Senate meeting was at the theater of Pompey, not the Senate house proper, which was under repair, but a large meeting room in Pompey's great theater complex. The irony of Julius Caesar being assassinated in a building named for his great rival was apparently lost on nobody, or perhaps it was perfectly deliberate. Cassius had a sense of theater. The conspirators had hidden daggers beneath their togas. They gathered around Caesar on a pretext, one of them presenting a petition, another reaching as if to touch his toga in supplication, gestures of deference that were actually positioning. Then one of them, a man named Casca, struck the first blow. It went into Caesar's neck or shoulder. It was not immediately fatal. Caesar grabbed Casca's arm, and then the rest of them stabbed him. All of them, one after another, 23 wounds according to later accounts, though a physician who examined the body afterward reportedly concluded that only one of the wounds was actually fatal. 22 of those blows may have been essentially superfluous from a medical standpoint, which is perhaps the most grimly Roman detail in this entire story. They were all going to be part of it. Everyone was going to share the responsibility. Ancient sources give Caesar another famous line, hear it to Brute, though this comes from Shakespeare, not from Latin historical accounts. What ancient sources actually report is more ambiguous and more human. Some say Caesar said nothing after Casca's first blow. Others say he spoke Greek in his final moments, a language that educated Romans used for intimacy, as English speakers might switch to a private language with someone close. If he said anything to Brutus, we don't actually know what it was. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey. His body lay there for some time before anyone moved it, because the Senate had scattered in panic, and nobody wanted to be the first to go near it. 3 of his slaves eventually carried him home. Now here is the part that the conspirators had not adequately planned, for which is everything that happened next. Brutus and Cassius had assumed hope, perhaps, that killing Caesar would automatically restore the Republic, that without the man the machinery of tyranny would simply stop, and the old institutions would reassemble themselves, and Romans would breathe a collective sigh of relief and get back to the business of being a republic. This was, to put it diplomatically, optimistic thinking. What actually happened was that the city went into shock. The markets closed. People locked their doors. Nobody was sure what was going to happen next, which is usually a bad sign. The conspirators had killed Caesar, but had no plan for what came after beyond a vague hope that things would sort themselves out in a Republican direction. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and co-consul, had been kept away from the Senate meeting. On the day of the assassination, the conspirators had discussed killing him too, and decided against it, which turned out to be an extremely consequential decision. Antony was not a subtle man, but he was a politically shrewd one when survival was the question. He negotiated with the conspirators, accepted a general amnesty for them, and seemed for a brief moment to be playing along. Then he gave the funeral oration. Caesar's had revealed that he had left money to every Roman citizen, a sum equivalent to about 3 months of an average laborer's wages. He had also left his gardens to the public. The man who had been portrayed as a tyrant had in his final testament given something to everyone. Antony read the will aloud at the funeral. He displayed Caesar's toga with its stab wounds. He described what had been done to a man who had shown clemency to his enemies and been repaid with daggers. The crowd erupted. What began as a funeral became a riot. The conspirators, who had expected public approval, found themselves instead fleeing the city, as the Roman mob burned furniture in the streets to make a pyre for Caesar, and then tried to burn the houses of the men who had killed him. It was historically speaking a bad sign for the Republic. What followed was years of civil war, messy, complicated, faction-ridden, frequently appalling. Antony formed an alliance with Caesar's adopted heir and great-nephew, a young man named Octavian, who would later take the name Augustus. They hunted down the conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, who had raised armies and tried to hold the eastern part of the empire, were defeated at the Battle of Philippi, and both died there, Cassius by suicide, after mistakenly believing the battle lost, Brutus a few days later with a dignity that ancient sources found genuinely moving and that Shakespeare later made immortal. The alliance between Antony and Octavian, as we also know from Cleopatra's story, eventually broke down. Antony went east and found Cleopatra. Octavian stayed in Rome and found a talent for political consolidation. That made Caesar himself look somewhat impulsive. The two men fought, and Octavian won, and Octavian became Augustus, and Augustus became Rome's first emperor, and the Republic never came back. The men who killed Caesar to save the Republic ended up creating the conditions for the Republic's permanent extinction. This is one of history's more ironic sequences of events, and history has a great many of them. But this one is particularly spectacular. The liberators were so certain that killing one man would solve the structural problem that they never stopped to ask whether the structural problem was bigger than one man. It was. The Roman Republic's institutions had been under strain for generations. Before Caesar ever crossed the Rubicon, the system was built for a city-state, not for a Mediterranean empire. It had no effective way to govern provinces, fairly no way to distribute the enormous wealth from conquests in a way that prevented catastrophic inequality, no way to integrate the army into civilian life without generals becoming warlords. Marius had been a warning. Sulla had been a warning. The chaos of the late Republic, the violence in the streets, the breakdown of political norms. All of this had been building for a century before Caesar was born. Caesar saw the problem clearly. His solution himself, essentially as the organizing principle of a reformed state, was not unreasonable given the circumstances, even if it wasn't what anyone who loved the idea of the Republic wanted to hear. He may have been right that the Republic in its traditional form could no longer function. What he failed to solve was the succession problem. What happens after you win a system built around your personal authority? He was planning to go east and fight the Parthians, and he may have been planning to settle the political question of what came after him when he returned. He ran out of time. What do we actually know about who Julius Caesar was beyond the monuments and the myths? Was by all accounts genuinely charismatic, not just politically effective, but personally magnetic in a way that made people want to follow him. Even when following him was objectively dangerous, his soldiers adored him. Ancient sources note that he knew the names of officers throughout his legions, that he shared their hardships, that he marched with them rather than riding when the situation called for it. He was also capable of extraordinary personal cruelty. The Gallic Wars involved atrocities that Caesar narrated in his own prose, with a certain breezy detachment that can feel disconcerting when you think about it too carefully. He was absurdly intelligent, not just militarily, but intellectually. He wrote poetry. He wrote a work on Latin grammar. He was interested in astronomy, in rhetoric, in philosophy. He could dictate letters to multiple secretaries simultaneously while riding on horseback, which is either a sign of extraordinary mental capacity or the kind of thing that people claim about great men and which may or may not be literally true, but which captures something real about the impression he made. There's something worth saying about the Rome Caesar came back to after Gaul, because it was not the Rome he had left. The city had changed. The Republic's political culture, always somewhat turbulent, had descended into something closer to organized chaos. Gangs controlled entire neighborhoods. Elections were routinely bought or disrupted by violence. The Senate, theoretically the supreme governing body of the greatest civilization in the Western world, spent much of its time in procedural warfare so petty and bitter that it could barely pass routine legislation. The traditional Roman virtues, gravitas dignitas, the solemn weight of civic duty, had become for many men in power a costume worn over very ordinary ambition. Caesar looked at this and drew a conclusion that was controversial then and remains controversial now. The Republic as it existed could no longer govern, not because Romans had become worse people, but because the system had not been designed for what Rome had become. A city-state constitution cannot easily manage an empire stretching from Scotland to Syria. The Senate could debate the grain supply of North Africa for weeks without resolving it, while a single competent governor with sufficient authority could fix the problem in an afternoon. Caesar had spent years as exactly that kind of governor in Gaul. He knew what worked, and what worked frustratingly for everyone who loved the old traditions looked a great deal like one person being in charge. His enemies were not entirely wrong about what he was doing. He was in a meaningful sense dismantling the Republic, not because he hated it, but because he believed it had already dismantled itself and someone needed to build something functional in its place. The tragedy, if it is a tragedy, is that the men who killed him to prevent this from happening only accelerated it. The decade of civil wars that followed the Ides of March did more damage to Roman Republican institutions than Caesar had done in his entire career. He was also, let us be honest, very vain about his hair. Ancient sources note that he was deeply sensitive about his baldness and combed what hair he had very carefully over the top to minimize it. He reportedly loved the right to wear a laurel wreath in public, not because it was a symbol of honor, but because it covered his head. A man who conquered Gaul and reformed the calendar had complicated feelings about going bald. There's something deeply human about this. He was generous to a fault with people he liked and capable of a cold political ruthlessness, when necessary, usually preferring to destroy opponents' careers rather than their bodies, which in Rome's political culture counted as practically gentle. He forgave people who had fought against him, sometimes spectacularly so, and was occasionally betrayed by the same people he had forgiven, which should perhaps have been a lesson, but apparently wasn't. He was, in other words, a human being of enormous complexity, living in an age that wanted him to be either a hero or a villain, and found him stubbornly both. The men who killed Caesar were not monsters. This is important to say plainly, because history has a tendency to flatten complicated people into simple roles, and the conspirators deserve a more honest accounting than either pure villainy or pure heroism. Most of them were men who had served Rome faithfully, who had genuine convictions about the Republic, who had watched what they believed was an illegal seizure of permanent power, and concluded, not unreasonably given the political philosophy of their time, that assassination was a legitimate response to tyranny. Brutus in particular was a man of genuine principle, which made his choice both more admirable and more tragic. He killed a man who had shown him mercy, spared his life, given him positions of honor. He did it not for personal gain, but because he believed it was right. He was wrong about the consequences, but being wrong about consequences does not make a person a villain. Cassius was more complicated. He was sharper, colder, more politically tactical, and ancient sources suggest he resented Caesar on a level that was partially personal. He was the organizer, the recruiter, the man who understood that Brutus' name and moral reputation were essential to giving the conspiracy legitimacy. Without Brutus, the assassination was just a group of senators with daggers. With Brutus, it was the liberators. Cassius knew this and used it, which is either cynical manipulation or shrewd political strategy. Depending on how you look at it, with Cassius the answer is probably both. What strikes modern readers, I think, is how human all of it was. The greatest drama in ancient history was driven not by inevitable historical forces, but by personal relationships, miscalculations, wounded pride, genuine idealism. and the kind of catastrophic overconfidence that comes from being very intelligent and very wrong at the same time. Brutus thought killing Caesar would restore the Republic. He was brilliant, he was educated, he was principled, and he was completely mistaken about how the Roman people would respond, how Antony would respond, how the legions would respond, and what the underlying forces shaping Roman politics actually were. Intelligence is not the same as wisdom, and wisdom is not the same as foresight, and foresight is perhaps the rarest quality in human history. The question of whether Caesar was good or bad for Rome is one that people have been arguing about ever since, and the disagreement is not merely academic. He is a mirror in which different political philosophies see themselves authoritarians. See a great man who understood that strong central power is what holds civilization together, republicans. See a man who destroyed a tradition of self-governance. For the sake of his own ambition, reformers. See someone who recognized that the old system had failed and tried to replace it with something more functional. He was probably some mixture of all three. What is certain is that his death changed Rome permanently and changed the world permanently. The empire that came after him, the Augustan settlement, the Principate, the long centuries of Roman imperial rule, was in many ways the world that Caesar's life had made possible. The roads, the laws, the administrative structures, the spread of Latin culture and Roman civilization across Europe and North Africa and the Near East. All of this flowed from a historical process in which Caesar was a decisive turning point. His name is still with us in languages that barely existed when he was alive, in cultures that were far beyond the reach of his legions. The word Caesar still echoes, Kaiser, Tsar. We still use the calendar he reformed. We still tell his stories. We still argue about what he meant. On a cold night in early spring, beside a statue of a man he had once defeated in a civil war, Julius Caesar fell, and in falling he paradoxically became larger, not smaller, not a man cut down, but a myth that kept growing, a shadow that fell across the centuries, a name that outlasted the empire he never quite got around to officially becoming emperor of. The Republic died with him. Whether it had been dying before he arrived, whether he killed it intentionally or accidentally, whether something better or worse took its place, these questions have no clean answers. History rarely does. What it offers instead of stories, and this one is among the most extraordinary ever lived. That's where we'll leave him tonight, not at the foot of Pompey's statue, but somewhere larger and harder to pin down, in a name that became a title, in a calendar on your phone, in the plays and films and arguments and history books that still can't quite agree on what to make of him. Maybe that's the most Caesar thing of all. Even in death he refuses to be settled. Thank you for spending this night in history with us. Sleep well, and we'll see you next time on Nightfall History.